want to speak today about the role of culture in economics, and in particular the relationship between markets and culture. I think it's probably fair to say that culture is something that's been relatively neglected by mainstream economists. I had a look over the weekend at the 7th edition of the best-selling economics textbook, which is Begg, Fisher and Dornbush. And if you look in the index of that and the book as a whole, there's one paragraph about culture, and that paragraph is on page 503. And it makes the point that the customs of some less developed countries may hinder their economic development. I think that's a very important point, a very good point, but it's a point that probably merits more than one paragraph in a 500-page book. So what I want to do today is say a few words about why I think culture is important, why I think we should talk about culture more in economics, and say finally what might be some of the policy implications of that approach. This neglect of culture, I think, is beginning to change. Despite the big textbooks still neglecting culture, I think in the academic discipline there is some change going on. There's a recent paper by Professor Peter Beckett at George Mason University in the United States, who wrote the introduction to our social capital book. And Peter Beckett charts the development of economics through 3 distinct phases. Now, the first phase he describes from the 1930s to the 70s. At that time he argues that political economy was concerned about prices and the role of prices in the economy. And in particular the relative ability of governments and markets to set prices, determine prices and attach prices to that represent the relative value of different goods and services. So from the 30s to the 70s, prices were the centre of economics. Now, Pete Beckett argues that round about the 70s, that debate was settled, if you like. That it was settled in the idea that markets were the best way to evaluate the relative value of different goods and services. So roughly about from the 1980s to the 90s, the debate shifted, and it moved from a focus on prices to a focus on institutions. And in particular, what was the impact of institutions like private property, like government, on economic development? I think, again, as Pete Beckett argues, institution analysis is now firmly ingrained within economics. If you look at any academic study of development, it's all about institutions. It's all about private property, the rule of law, sound money, the role of government, if you like. And Pete Beckett argues that we've moved from prices for institutions, and now it's culture. That's the big debate now. That's where the focus is now, is on culture. So what I want to do today is talk about where I think the debate on culture is and where it might be going. Well, the first question I think to ask is to ask what do we mean by culture? How do we define culture? How might economists define it? How might they use it? And also, why might they be interested in it? Well, by culture, I think we refer to values, norms and beliefs. How do people understand the world and their place in it? Now, I imagine most people here have some familiarity with Max Weber's work on the Protestant work ethic and the development of capitalism. Now, Weber's central thesis in that book was that there were a particular set of beliefs that were conducive to economic development, in particular the development of capitalist economies. Namely, the sort of Calvinist belief that if we work hard, God will reward us in this life, and therefore having material wealth, having money, is a good thing. And Weber argued that if we want to explain why capitalism developed in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, we need to look at the values that people held. In particular, the spread of Protestantism, the spread of Calvinism. That is a good explanation of the variable, Weber argued. I think that probably the 3 biggest books in development economics in the last year or so will be those by Paul Collier, William Easterly and Jeffrey Sachs. And in each of these books, culture is at the centre. They're all interested in how culture impacts on development. So now what I want to talk about is one aspect of culture, and that's social capital, which is the subject of, as Richard said, the book that I've recently written with Mark Pennington. So what is the role of social capital in a market economy? Well, social capital is a phrase originally coined by an anthropologist, a woman called Jane Jacobs, who lived in New York and wrote studies of how cities developed, how cities existed, and how they expanded. And her most famous book was The Death and Life of Great American Cities. first published in, I think, 1961. In that book, Jacobs talks about social capital. And social capital for her is the like informal networks that link people in a big city. So the networks that link shopkeepers, their customers, people live on the same street, people are neighbours, people might be friends. And these informal networks she described as a city's irreplaceable social capital. So if a city is going to thrive, if it's going to spontaneously generate wealth and well-being, then we need these informal networks of communication, of trust, of reciprocity. They must be in place amongst a relatively stable population. So people must have time to get to know one another, to build up trust, to communicate, to live together, if you like. So social capital then, we could define it as a resource that exists in relationships between people. So in that sense, social capital could be a factor of production. And there's also a broader application of social capital, and this is the one that's usually picked up by economists. And this is that social capital can reduce the transaction costs of trade. So if people trust one another not to renege on contracts, not to cheat on a deal, then it means the enforcement of contracts is cheaper. You have to spend less time on legal enforcement, on drawing up very detailed contracts, because you trust the people that you're dealing with. Well, there's yet another, if you like, important distinction here, and that's between bridging and bonding social capital. Now, the big work on social capital in political science was written by a professor at Harvard University called Robert Putnam. And Putnam draws a distinction between bonding and bridging social capital. Now, bonding social capital describes the cohesion that exists within small groups of people. People know one another quite well, might be family members, might be close friends. They feel like they're bonded together. So people have the same information, same knowledge, same perspectives perhaps. They're bonded together. Bridging social capital, however, describes networks that link acquaintances. People who don't know one another so well, they're joined by bridging social capital. People might be very different culturally, socially. They're bridged together rather than bonded. I think what's clear is that for a market economy to function, we need both bonding and bridging social capital. If we have societies with an absence of bridging social capital, where perhaps we have very, very exclusive ethnic groups, then it becomes much more difficult to build, if you like, a strong market economy. People need to be bridged together, to trust one another, who might be otherwise strangers. In the absence of that, economic development, I think it's very difficult to achieve. And that suggests, if you like, that property rights, the rule of law, the sound money, while these are all important to development, they're probably not enough on their own. We probably need also social capital. Now, if social capital is as important as it's generally becoming recognised, for many people that creates an argument for government intervention. If social capital is really essential to economic development, the argument goes we need government to provide it. It has to be supplied by government because it's so important. And it's quite a similar argument to previous arguments about industrial planning, about economic planning. In the past it was believed that, if you like, the right distribution of resources among different sectors of the economy was key to economic development. If we believe instead that it's the right mix of social capital, bonding and bridging, then again, the argument is that government should do that. The same way that government undertook industrial planning in the 70s and 80s, it's an argument that government should undertake cultural planning. And the main focus of our book is really to try and address that argument, to try and show why that argument might not be satisfactory. I think the first problem with the argument really is it puts a lot of faith in the ability of governments to pick winners. It's the idea that government can know which cultural values are going to be successful in terms of economic development. That's a problem, is because all the evidence suggests that some cultural values are more successful economically than other cultural values. And if you think of Max Weber, that was Weber's central argument. Weber's argument back in the late 19th century was that it was one set of values, if you like, Protestantism and Calvinism, that was much more successful than, say, Catholic values. Weber argued that the Protestant faith was a much greater advantage in economic development than the Catholic faith. Largely because the Catholic faith puts some value on poverty, whereas the Calvinist faith puts value on wealth. And there's similar evidence from right around the world that, again, that some cultural values are more successful economically than other cultural values. One example which is really understudied in the academic literature, and I have plans afoot to fill this gap, but one big example is the Ugandan Asians. You may be aware that the Asians who lived in Uganda came to East Africa some very early in the 16th, 17th centuries, most in the 19th century, from India and what is now Pakistan. And by the mid-20th century, they were the principal entrepreneurs in Uganda. They had concentrated a great deal of the wealth, they owned lots of the small businesses, and they're extremely economically successful. Now there's certainly evidence that the Ugandan Asians were successful partly because they were favoured by the British rulers of Uganda, the colonial masters if you like. They regarded them as more trustworthy than the Ugandan natives, and that's maybe true. But I think there's also something in the values those people had. Now, the Ugandan Asians, I'm sure you're all aware, were expelled by Idi Amin from Uganda in August 1972. They were given 3 months to leave. And they were allowed to leave with only the possessions they could carry. All the wealth, all of the wealth they generated, they had to leave behind. They couldn't take out any cash, only a few possessions. And that was 70,000 people left Uganda in November 1972. The great majority came to Britain. Some went to America and Canada, a few went back to India and Pakistan, but the vast majority came to Britain. Now I believe there's one study of what happened to those people, and that study is in the context of refugee politics, like what happens to refugees. And that study tracks the Ugandan Asians over 10 years. Now 12 months after they arrived in Britain, 25% of those people were unemployed, and 75% were living below the poverty line. So 12 months, 1 year on, a quarter were unemployed, 3/4 living in poverty. 10 years after their arrival in Britain, they had better formal education than any other ethnic groups. So they were better qualified as a group than the whites, the blacks, if you like, the Indians, any other groups, like the Ugandan Asians. They had lower rates of unemployment than the national average, the highest rate of self-employment, and basically they transformed their socio-economic status. As you know now, if you go to places like Leicester, the big sort of jewellery industry in Leicester, it's run by the Ugandan Asians basically, and they're an extremely wealthy group of people. Essentially you have a group of people who go to a country as refugees, beginning with nothing, and in about a decade become economically more successful than, if you like, the host population, more successful than any other economic group. Now, I think that the best way to explain that, or as far as I can see at the moment, the only way to explain it really, is in terms of the values those people have, in terms of their norms, beliefs and culture. And basically the values that the Ugandan Asians seems to have in very simple terms, if you like, is simply values of hard work, values of self-sufficiency, values of self-help. It was very important to those people culturally that they weren't seen as a burden to the society that they went into. They wanted to show that they could be self-sufficient, they could help themselves, and they could make the most of their situation. I think the challenge for government, if it wishes to engage in cultural planning, is can it identify these values? And can it engender them in a population? And how do we identify the salient values? Because if we take the Ugandan Asians, for all we know there may be some values that they hold that are not important or even hinder development. It's a case of identifying the salient values and encouraging those to spread. So there's a real danger, if you like, that if government were to invest in cultural planning and encouraging certain values, it might invest in the wrong set of values. I think there's a second problem with the idea that government can engage in this sort of cultural planning. And that is that if government offers funding, perhaps as it does under the banners of community development, social cohesion, it may actually increase tension between different groups in society. And in so doing, it could undermine the bridging social capital that I think is most important to economic development. So I think I would certainly say that in a market economy, development of bridging social capital is a positive sum game. It's based on the principle of mutual advantage. So if we work together in the economy, we do this on the basis that both parties are going to benefit. But it's not the case when people compete for public money. By definition, public money is a zero-sum game. So if one particular group gets a portion of a set basket of funds or a set parcel of funding, that denies the other group the opportunity to get the same money. So in other words, one group's gain is likely to be another group's loss. So hence, when government sets aside money to fund community development and social cohesion, there's a risk, at the very least, that it's going to increase tension between different groups. The final point I want to make in this presentation is, I suppose, a question about whether the market can supply social capital. I have to take a step back here in a sense. The idea that government should apply social capital, I think, is based upon the idea that social capital has the qualities of a collective or public good. That is because the benefits are collective rather than individual, people are going to underinvest in it. So because it's very hard for one person to capture the benefits of bridging social capital, they're unlikely to do things that are going to engender it. That will be an argument for government intervention, clearly. But I think I would challenge that view. I would challenge the view that social capital is a public good or a collective good. I think rather social capital has individual benefits that, if you like, are self-interested for the people who might gain it. And this comes down to some very old ideas in economics. If you think back to Adam Smith, a big part of Adam Smith's work was on the idea of reputation, and the idea that a merchant needed a reputation of trustworthiness, of probity, in order to succeed in the marketplace. And that, I'm sure you're all aware, was the sort of do commerce thesis, or the gentle commerce thesis. And Smith argued that commercial society, the marketplace, was self-sustaining because virtuous behaviour arose spontaneously. It was in the interest of each individual, of each merchant, of each tradesperson, to have a good reputation. If they didn't have that, people wouldn't trade with them, and therefore they couldn't be successful economically. There's a famous quote, which is in the lectures on jurisprudence, one of Smith's lesser-known works, I suppose, where Smith writes that wherever commerce is to be found, probity and punctuality always accompany it. So in the greater part of the people are merchants, they always bring probity and punctuality into fashion. And these, therefore, are the principal virtues of a commercial nation. I'm not sure that I'd put so much store in punctuality, but certainly probity is quite important, I think. It doesn't make commercial sense for a firm or a large corporation to behave in a ruthless manner. I think that is, if you like, is reputational suicide or commercial suicide. So it's in the interest of big companies like Nike or McDonald's even to try to maintain a good reputation. They can't simply travel around the world behaving ruthlessly because it damages their commercial profile. The second point I'd make here is that, if you like, trust or assurance is itself a valuable commodity. And that means that the market is going to supply it. Something that has a great value attached to it. We can rely on the market, I would argue, to supply it rather than undermine it. So a very simple market failure approach would suggest that where there are informational asymmetries, where people don't know enough about the people they're trading with to trust them, then potentially profitable trades will not occur or will fail because of that lack of trust. But I think what market failure theory fails to take on board is that entrepreneurs are going to intervene to supply that trust. So in fact, there's a trust gap, but entrepreneurs are looking to fill that gap and make trade happen. And there are almost limitless examples of this. I know Richard's done some work on this too. Things like brand names, it's clearly a reputational device to provide trust. A money-back guarantee, again, it's a reputational device that provides trust. Even something as simple, if you like, as a credit card. It's not only a very inefficient way to borrow money, but it's also says something about the reputation of the person who holds it. I think that's the real value of a credit card. It's not nothing to do with borrowing, as some banks have said. It's a very silly way to borrow money. But it says a lot about you as a person, that someone would be willing, in theory, to lend you a sum of money. Well, let me just make two concluding points. The first point is that I think economics as a discipline is changing, and it's changing for the better. I think it's becoming less of a distinct science. It's making links with sociology, with cultural studies, I think those are enriching both, if like all the different disciplines. So my view would be that economics and sociology, economics and cultural studies have a lot to learn from one another. And I think that interchange, that exchange is going to be very exciting, very interesting. And that's where the future lies, I'm pretty sure. Secondly, I think this growing appreciation of culture in economics is going to lead to some new calls for government intervention. It's going to be argued that if culture is important, then government ought to be supplying it. But I think there's good reasons to be cautious about those sort of arguments before we embark on such an enterprise. Because rather like industrial planning in the 70s, I think it will probably prove counterproductive.